So I'd like to answer the question in two parts. First of all, on the production side, most of the models that we see for climate change assume that we will try to be producing the same crops that we are now. And what we're finding at Bioversity is that there are a lot of crops that are, we call them neglected crops or minor crops, that are much better suited to the evolving climate conditions than the crops that may be grown now. So, for example, millet or sorghum, sorghum in particular, is much hardier than maize and more resistant to drought. And so one way to address the production side is to actually look at the kinds of crops that will be better suited to these these changing climate conditions. The second issue is that in many developing countries, the yield of these crops is far below the attainable yield, the maximum yield that countries can get. And this means that with better production practices, better storage, better handling, we can see increased capacity to produce. On the consumption side, those models are also assuming that demand in many parts of the world will mirror the demand that we have in Western economies, so that you see as people move into the middle class in developing countries, as they move into urban areas, the sort of assumption is that the demand patterns will move towards more meat in particular. Now, that's also not inevitable. There are ways to shape demand, to adapt, to encourage people to eat a more diversified diet. Certainly in many areas they need to increase protein, but perhaps not as much as some of us eat in the Western world. So I think there are ways also to help through government policies, government incentives, education programs, and by producing a diversity of food, that we can address both the demand and the consumption side. I would like to talk about one program that Bioversity has that's a very good example of how to connect science to local people. And we call this project Seeds for Needs. It's a project we have operating now in 11 countries, but I'd like to talk about the work we're doing in Ethiopia because it's a very good example. So in this project, we work directly with the National Biodiversity Institute, which manages the gene banks in Ethiopia. We, with them, identified durum wheat as a crop that is grown by many poor people. It's a food security crop. It's not made into pasta in Ethiopia. And what we did was, in cooperation with the National Biodiversity Institute, we went back into the gene bank of Ethiopia and screened the material that they have in their gene bank to find varieties of durum wheat that were more resistant to drought. And we worked with the Scuola Santa Ana in Pisa to actually do the trait identification. We then worked very closely with the Ethiopian National Agricultural Research System and local university to basically grow these varieties out to make sure that they were true to type. And then we immediately went and worked with farmers' organizations to move directly to trials in farmers' fields. And what was interesting about this is that we used a sort of a crowdsourcing mechanism. So instead of doing a small number of trials in a few places, we did a lot of trials in a lot of places. And we're getting direct citizen feedback, citizen science feedback from the farmers that we're working with on whether these varieties are working for them, whether they have better yield, whether they tolerate drought, but also how they taste, how they cook, whether or not there's sufficient straw for the animals. So it's a nice example of a project where we are bringing a certain set of applications, and we are connecting the gene bank, which for a long time I think had the attitude of we're protecting our heritage, but not that we're giving that heritage back. So working with them and with illiterate farmers, but who are scientists, because they're giving us direct feedback. And I think the other really nice thing about this is, so Ethiopia is a secondary center of origin for durum wheat. And yet, all of the so-called improved varieties that were being grown in Ethiopia had no Ethiopian germplasm. It was all European germplasm. So what we've discovered in the Ethiopian gene bank is Ethiopian wheat that is actually much better suited to their climate conditions. So we have that same project in 11 countries, including very large efforts in India. So we think there's a lot of wealth in these gene banks that is basically undiscovered. Well, again, let me use this Seeds for Needs project as an example. So we involve women in this citizen science research. In India, there's a very strong women's group that is actively engaged. In fact, many of them, they are much better farmers than their husbands are. And we design the work so that we get input from the women farmers into this project, not only the men. So it's, in a way, it's empowering these women to be part of a program like this, and their image is being changed, I guess, in their community. The other thing I would say is that it tends to be the case, not always, but it tends to be the case that women grow these neglected and underutilized species. They're usually food security crops. They have not necessarily been the crops that have been benefited from the big research investments, public or private research investments. So we feel that if these crops have traits that will make them better adapted to climate change or to improve nutrition, that by promoting those crops we will also be supporting the activities of the women.